series. The purpose of this series is to shine a spotlight on one of the disciplines within the theme entertainment industry that may not be as well known or understood. And the intent is to give students and TEA members an opportunity to learn more about some of the many, many different disciplines it takes to put themed entertainment attractions together. Think of it as us pulling the curtain back and looking a little further behind the scenes. This is the first of a series. Basically, we'll be looking at a lot of different disciplines: structural, electrical, mechanical, architecture. But for me, the logical starting point for this is landscape architecture. And the reason for that is because that's the first impression that guests get as they approach a brand new attraction. And it's also the first chance we get to start telling the story of the experience that they're about to go through. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dan Herman and Maro Urena from Rabben Herman Design Office. And they're going to tell us everything we need to know about landscape architecture. So go ahead and take it away, Dan.
Walter, you didn't tell them this was a 6-hour presentation.
I did not.
No.
It's too bad.
Well, yeah. First, let me thank you for joining us, and I hope that you find the presentation interesting. My name is Dan Herman, and I'm a principal at Rabben Herman Design Office. As you can see, I've been involved in the theme park industry for a long time. I've had the opportunity to work with all of the major Hollywood studios, most of the independent theme park companies, and most of the concept design companies. To me, theme park design is really unique and unusual. On one hand, you are designing an environment based on an IP created by someone else. That means you're using someone else's ideas other than yours, not typical for us on projects. On the other hand, you're creating these incredible visual immersive environments that people experience in 3 dimensions. Up until this time, they've only visualized those environments when reading books or from what they see on a film.
Hello, my name is Maro Urena, and I've been with RHCO for about 13 years now, working as a designer and a project manager. And I've had the opportunity to work on several theme park projects, so not nearly as many as Dan. All of them very unique, fun, and challenging. And it's been a great experience to see these parks go from lines on paper to a physically built environment, which one can then enjoy walking through. And Walter, I just want to thank you again for the invitation, and we look forward to sharing what role we play in the development of a theme park.
Absolutely, Maro. And looking at your list, I've realized we've worked together quite a bit, all 3 of us, on a lot of projects. So what's been your favorite project so far in your experience?
Several favorites, but one of them which we did work on together was Universal Studios project here in Hollywood. Enjoyed that one quite a bit because it's local. So aside from having the opportunity to work on that from design to construction, it was a great experience to be able to then go to the park with my family, walk through it with my wife and kids, and just enjoy the work.
Very cool. How about you, Dan?
Well, my favorite project was actually one of the earliest projects in my career. It was for Islands of Adventure. At that time, I worked for a company called EDA, and we were one of only several consultants that were selected to work on all 6 lands. So we were responsible for the area development, both the design and managing all the other area development sub-consultants. So Walter, I think you were a young plumbing engineer at the time working on the project. The lighting, site architecture, civil engineering, and graphics and signage. So I worked for over 2 years.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
I cut my teeth on that project.
Yes, that was quite a project. What was amazing is there were probably 1,000 people, both from Universal and the consultant side, all kind of having the same energy, the same highs and lows through the design and then through the construction, finally to opening. And Universal made its mark, I think, with that project to do really unique attractions and environments. And I think it was a turning point for everyone involved. So, if we could just start and talk a little bit about Rabben Herman Design Office. I've really been lucky to start my career at a boom in the theme park industry. Over that time, Disney and Universal has added 10 parks. Warner Brothers, Paramount, Fox, and Lego all developed parks, and many entrepreneurs in Asia and the Middle East developed parks. There were so many opportunities. It was a rewarding time to be a landscape architect. RHDO really is focused on the premier companies, primarily Hollywood studios, because they had the best chance of being built. I think what I'm proudest of is pre-COVID, over 90 million people a year visited projects that we had a major part of planning or designing. So if you're not familiar, the question you may be asking, what is landscape architecture? When I was going to college, my mom continued to ask me that, and I described to her that landscape architects design everything outside of the building. This includes the walkways, not just picking whether it's concrete or brick, but thinking about how people actually move through and perceive space. We design the landscape planting, not just putting trees in a plan, but using plant material to focus views, provide shade in areas where people sit, or block views that are attractive. We also get to design all the amenities that enrich a space: fencing, railings, water features, site furniture, and garden architecture. These are just a few of the examples that our office has designed around the world over the last 20 years. Walter asked me when we put this presentation together to talk about how landscape architecture differs in the theme park world. I made a list so long that Walter said that could be a presentation in itself. So I chose these 5 items. Let me first say, though, that in both worlds, we use the same design and technical skills, but we use them in a different way. In the theme park world, landscape architecture is not called landscape architecture, but area development. I don't know where this term came from, but probably like so much in the theme park world, it started at Disney. Unlike in the real world, theme park design often originates with an intellectual property, or called IP for short. Your design is reviewed by the holder of that intellectual property or their representative from the beginning of design to the end and at pre-opening of the park. World famous intellectual properties like Harry Potter, Jurassic Park, or Mario Brothers need to be recreated 3-dimensionally, accurately down to the very last detail, because that's what their fans and the intellectual property holder expect.
Another element Another element that's unique in the theme park world is that we have the opportunity to work with an expanded palette of materials. We have shotcrete, resin, reinforced fiberglass, scenic painting. Another difference is that we often rely on owner-provided mock-ups. This may take a lot of time in the beginning, but it provides some clear direction to the contractor. It helps eliminate a lot of the misunderstanding in the bidding and offers a clear example of what is expected from the contractor as far as the level of detail and quality of work. A 5th item that's different, is this was one of our favorites. We get the opportunity to use mature trees and shrubs. So when installation is complete, you have close to a finished project. Most projects use trees that come in 24, 36-inch boxes. But in the theme park industry, you typically want to use 40s, 60s, 72-inch boxes. So when installed, it looks great. This gives you great impact at the end of the product when you're done. But installing large plant material has its own challenges.
What is the landscape architect's role in the theme park industry? Well, landscape architects are often involved in these 5 major tasks. But today we're going to talk about the 3 tasks highlighted in red: preparing theme park master plans, the detailed design of site improvements, and construction observation. Let's start with master planning because it's the first step in the process. We think of master planning theme parks as a 2-headed monster. When I first started working at theme parks, I was very surprised to learn that it's an analytical, numbers-based process that you don't often see or hear about. When we think of theme park design, we look at beautiful key art, models, and computer-generated fly-throughs. But it's clearly a left brain and right brain process. Who knew all of this neat stuff was based on carefully analyzed data on how many people would come and visit and how much money they would spend when they did?
Yeah, I remember driving with Dan to a meeting. I think I was on my way to my very first theme park meeting to discuss a new project. And I remember asking Dan, so where does one start with such a project? The scale of the projects are so large, sometimes the land boundaries are not yet defined, attractions are still being designed, so many elements, so many moving parts. And it seemed kind of overwhelming to me. So again, where does one start? It would have, at that point, it would have never occurred to me to start by asking what the theoretical hourly ride capacity for this park was, or asking about the economic feasibility study. But unfortunately, sometimes one does have to start with numbers, with math. So for today, we're going to share with you a very simplified version of the process. As Dan said, it is 2-headed, which means it has 2 tracks, an analytical one and a creative one. It can be started on either track and usually depends on the client. It's also a circular process. And when done properly, it takes a long time. Major companies may spend from 1 to 36 months developing, testing, and revising ideas. And it's often completed as a concept master plan and a final master plan. So Dan is going to start by briefly walking you through the analytical side by discussing the economic feasibility study.
As Maro said, we could have easily started this explanation on the creative side. The economic feasibility study is not conducted by the landscape architect, but by people trained in market analysis and/or economics. The process most widely used today was developed by Buzz Price, who completed his first study for Disney in 1953. In simple terms, this process analyzes the market area to determine how many people will come to the theme park and how much they will spend. Now, this is an example of one table taken from an economic analysis. And in this example, you can see that annual attendance is the first number to be derived, and that number is then divided by different time periods. But it's ultimately used to determine the peak in park attendance, which in turn is used to determine the hourly entertainment capacity of the total park. In this example, every guest during the peak in park hour should have 1.25 experiences, or if you stayed at the park 8 hours, 10 experiences in a day. This includes the time spent in a queue, riding the attractions, and eating some more, and then finally getting that one last thing to eat before you leave. For this park, it was required to have 29,100 experiences in an hour. The second chart, and really where landscape architects come into play and start to use these numbers, is to calculate the areas or sizes of all the support activities. As you can see in this chart, the number of seats for food and beverage facilities, the square footage of retail space, the number of required parking spaces, and even the size of the park and the total site. In a separate analysis, the economic consultant will also estimate how much each guest will spend. This is called the per cap revenue, or per caps. That number and the attendance is used to calculate the warranted investment or the total budget of the park. That budget guides the design team's selection and budget for attractions, shows, and rides, the amount of theming on facades, and the level of area development. You can imagine two parks, both having an attendance of approximately 5 million people, but one with a budget of $500 million and the second with a budget of $2 billion. Obviously, the $2 billion park will be much different. A parallel step in the process is the big idea. What is the park going to be about?
So the big idea can come from anywhere. It's not necessarily the landscape architect's responsibility. Here are some examples of park logos which were chosen specifically because you can see how each of them gives you a clear indication of what the project is all about. The park's big idea or its theme is very clear. Think about Islands of Adventure. The park is clearly about adventure. Each land is located around a large lagoon, and to get from one land to another, you cross a bridge, giving the illusion that each land was an island. Each bridge has a different theme related to the land that you're entering.
Now let's jump back to the analytical side, developing the program. This chart is a summary version of the program. The actual program is much more detailed. If I remember correctly, it was probably 15 pages long and includes areas for the front and back of house for every facility, as well as many other attributes. The top chart shows the capacity of each land, but the middle chart to me is a bit more interesting. In this chart, you can see the types of attractions, dark rides, simulator, etc., and the instant and hourly capacity. Remember, a few slides back, we talked about entertainment capacity, and here is where that number comes into play. We can tell by looking at this program that we have a very nice, but not over-the-top park. 3 dark rides balanced by a high concentration of less expensive attractions to fill out a program providing just over 27,000 units of entertainment capacity. The bottom chart confirms this, with just over half the attractions rated at 4 or 5 star. In some projects, instead of stars, you might hear letters, often referencing E or the E-ticket, which relates back to the start of Disneyland, which in 1955 used individual tickets for all the attractions, the E-ticket being used for the newest, most advanced, popular rides and attractions. And that term is still used today.
So good news for the viewers. That wraps up the brief intro to the analytical side of the process. Now we'll get back to the creative side, which is Dan's, and I'm sure all of landscape architects' favorite part of the process, and that's developing the concept plan.
Well, this is my favorite part. The landscape architect or park designer is starting with a blank piece of paper and trying to determine how to give the big idea form and tell the story. Sometimes you're recreating a significant scene from a film, like a meandering path through a jungle. Though, in my experience, the initial concept formation doesn't always happen with a plan. Sometimes a studio will develop key art, or a creative director will prepare a written story to guide the process. Obviously, as landscape architects, we draw plans. And to the trained observer, the plan can tell you many things. Where is the entrance to the park? What is the circulation concept? A loop, a hub and spoke, or figure eight? Does the park have a central feature like a castle or a lagoon? How many lands does it have? And in what order are they arranged? What forms do the individual lands take? And how do they all go together to tell the story behind the big idea? These are 4 examples of plans representing the same idea, expressed first in a written story that was prepared by the creative director and provided to the design team. We prepared these plans, completed by 3 different designers. They represent the very first drawings prepared on the project, trying to capture the big idea. The 2 plans on the top and the one on the bottom are outdoors. The plan on the bottom right is indoors. Well, what is the big idea, you ask? An unknown force crashed into Earth and left a huge crater. Another civilization, many years later, came back and had the bright idea to develop a theme park around the crater. In the plan on the top left, man constructed buildings on the inside of the crater. The plan on the bottom left the crater intact as history, and everything was built outside the crater walls. The plan on the top right, you can see the crater is much smaller and just part of the park, and probably the only plan within budget. In the plan on the bottom right, I think the designer forgot about the story and the crater altogether.
As Dan said, the concept can start in many ways in a written story or plan. Another way is through the development of key art. These are examples of key art images for a different project. For this project, the concept for each land was first expressed in these images, which were prepared by a movie studio. Our designers then used these key art to design lands and give the scenes a physical, 3-dimensional form on plan.
In this very simplified process description, the last step is preparing the master plan. As Maro said earlier, we often go through 2 cycles, the concept master plan to get buy-off and approval to make sure the project is financially feasible, and if the project is, a final master plan. Both phases are documented in a report. They include the overall plan, more detailed plans for each land, architectural plans for the facilities and the attractions, and key art for all of the major and most important attractions. The master plan report also includes preliminary engineering plans for utilities, grading, plans for parking and access, often accompanied by traffic studies, and any other plan that may be specific or needed for a particular site or project. The master plan is a tremendous effort that involves many, many, many other people than the landscape architect. The team has a wide variety of expertise. The landscape architect, as I said earlier, focuses most of their attention on the plan aspect. This is an example of an illustrative master plan. It illustrates all the components of the project: the theme park, parking, retail dining and entertainment zone, and a hotel and conference center. Hopefully, you can see that each land within the theme park also has a clear and different form. You can see the primary circulation is a loop, and hopefully, again, you can see the character of the outdoor development environment starting to take form. There's an urban street, a garden-esque land, an informal pathway with strong landscape land, and a futuristic land. Obviously, I can't tell you the names or more information, but hopefully you get the idea. Notice in the futuristic land, there's almost no planting.
Yeah, I was joking with Dan, saying Dan seems to have a very pessimistic view of the future. But some of you might find it funny or odd to have almost no planting planned, no planting in a land. And this would be an example of trying to remain true to the land's IP. With this particular IP, planting was very sparse. And so we had to work within the limits that the IP has set.
You know, it's funny, Dan, you can always tell a new person in the industry because they refer to that site plan as an illustrative site plan instead of illustrative.
Yeah, or an engineer. As I said, the master plan has much more detail than we're sharing today. And I just wanted to share two other exhibits that the landscape architect prepares to explain the plan. This is one of the exhibits, and it shows the different lands and buildings and attractions within that. Example, you can see there are 8 attractions. Well, let's go to the next slide when we talk about that. This is another exhibit. And in this exhibit, you can see 8 attractions that have a THRC, or that's a theoretical ride capacity, back to that entertainment opportunities number of over 1,000, and 2 are near over 2,000. So you know it has more coaster and big box, high volume dark rides. There's also a grouping of low number attractions, and that tells you that it's probably a land oriented to children. This park is not based on the numbers shown to you earlier, but it has a capacity of over 20,000. Here is an aerial view prepared by a concept artist in the theme park style. You can see how the artist has incorporated character and life into this illustration. Very compelling. Oftentimes, the artist will move key elements to make them more visible, or draw certain elements larger in life to give them focus and attention. Well, I think that's enough about master planning. Let's talk about area development and what it is. Within the theme park world, there are 3 key areas of design: attractions, facilities. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, attractions are the fun part. Facilities are the part that I think aren't so fun. And then finally, area development.
Yeah, and as Dan might have explained to his mom, area development is it's everything outside of the facility boxes. It includes all of these items. Items in red are items which the landscape architect is responsible for, such as hardscape, landscape, and planting, while Walter and his company EXP would be responsible for designing most of the other items in black, storm and sanitary, sewer, power, etc.
Let's look at just a few of the projects that I've been involved in designing over the length of my career. The landscape architect is designing the outdoor environment to reinforce that big idea. As landscape architects, we not only design all of the elements to create the desired character, but at the same time, we have to work closely with the owner's operations team, retail team, maintenance, tech services, and show teams to make sure that we can integrate all of their requirements into the design. At the same time, the design must look as if a single hand designed everything: the architecture, the site improvements, the site lighting, signage, and graphics. Many times it's representing a memorable scene or building from a property that all of its fans will recognize and know if any detail has been designed incorrectly. These are a few other examples. The landscape architect designed these land gates shown in the image on the top left, pretty clearly taken from a film, but they're not exact replicas. We had to create a design appropriate to the scale of the park, big enough to seem impressive, but not oversized. This is much different than designing gates that are used in carefully orchestrated scenes in a film. Here, it's three-dimensional with people passing through in both directions. Once we resolved the scale of the gates, we had to coordinate the signage design and the gas lantern effects. We had to work with the mechanical engineer to locate the control for the gas, with the lighting designer to make sure the sign could be held up by the sign, and then make sure any plant material on the ground plane did not block any uplighting of the sign. Sometimes we're not recreating known environments like the Springfield and the Simpsons or Jurassic Park, and we need to find other relevant and meaningful reference. The water feature on the top right is located at the entrance of a land all about Hollywood. Our designer was inspired by an old postcard featuring the choreography of the dancing chorus girls of Busby Berkeley. In his productions, he focused on the geometric patterns of dancers to create unusual forms, in this case, a multi-tiered cake. If you are knowledgeable of early Hollywood history, you might know about Mr. Berkeley and his intricate choreography, and when you visited the park, would understand the genesis for the fountain. If you didn't know this history and you visited the park, I'd hope you still think it was a pretty damn cool fountain.
So Dan has just talked about all the front-end work of the design and coordination process. The third role of the landscape architect takes part in is what is known as construction observation. In the theme park world, we spend a lot more time in the field than we do on a typical project. Much of this field work is known as construction observation. And this is when we go out there and make sure everything is being implemented according to plan. It's also when we try to address and resolve any uncoordinated items that may have appeared during the process.
So, Mauro, it might be important to point out, we oftentimes put a lot of pipe and conduit in the ground, and why it's so important to coordinate with your elements. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it is something we do coordinate quite a bit during the design phase. We do so by sharing one another's plans, overlay it. If we spot that one of your lines is running through our trees, we'll let you know. And if you need to have a line in a specific location, we'll accommodate that. But things, like I said, things do come up during the process, and sometimes we do have these conflicts arise in the field. And it's important because on plan, I could see a contractor looking at the plan and saying, yeah, the line will fit there. It'll accommodate that tree. It looks like it will on plan. But in the real world, that tree has a root ball, which has a depth and width. And if they're not aware of that, they're going to put that right where we're planning to have a featured tree maybe. And the problem will be that we'll either be ripping out newly installed lines, or we won't be placing that tree. So it's very important to coordinate these items and trying to pick up a lot of these conflicts before we get out there in the field.
Yeah, that might not be a problem on day one, but 3, 4 years down the road, when that tree's roots have gone deeper and grabbed hold of some of that piping, you're going to have broken pipes, and it's just Mother Nature. So, good point.
All right, let's look at the design process. There are 5 major tasks in the designing of a theme park, beginning at concept design and ending with construction observation, as Mauro just told you. I would like to say this is the same process that we use for non-theme park projects as well as theme park projects. It is a long-standing industry standard that each step builds on itself, adding more detail and information to the design as you progress from step to step. Let's look at a particular project in a little more detail. These images show some of the work completed by the owner's design team before we were engaged on the project. These images explore items the owner was concerned about: building massing, view sequences, locations of trees and streetlights, and outdoor eating areas.
Here's an example of a simple site analysis diagram. These diagrams are prepared as a first step to show how the land would function. Here we may note where guests would enter, what will be their first view, their first impression of the land, what views will follow, what are the key scenes. We'll also want to note existing conditions and what are some of the challenges there may be. These simple diagrams are very helpful for gathering all the relevant issues and challenges on one sheet and communicating it to the other team members or client, and doing so in a very clear and concise way. After some site analysis, we move on to prepare a concept diagram.
This plan shows our design team's interpretation of the concept. This design was for a well-known and loved IP, so we had to be as true to the IP as possible. On the plan, you can see the building masses in the yellow or brown colors, the main street running through the middle of the land with adjacent sidewalks, the location of street trees, outdoor patios, and other gathering spaces, as well as the treatment of 3 entrances, which is unusual for a land. At the same time, this pathway was the main circulation route through the park. Everyone, and I mean everyone, coming to this park, that's 30 to 40,000 people a day, would pass through the middle of this land. As designers, we had to determine how to make a width capable of handling that volume of traffic while still capturing the character and scale of a small town main street.
Here are some examples of some quick hand sketching, illustrating how the concept plan intends to capture some of the key scenes and how we're intending to use the IP. In the theme park world, so much of the communication is done through 3D imagery, hand sketching or modeling. The landscape architect can't rely on planned graphics alone. One needs to be able to share their ideas 3-dimensionally, or you might end up with members of the team, consultants again, or clients, not understanding what one's trying to do.
Plans, like stuff that's been released. Yeah, like right now they're showing a Simpsons line.
Uh-oh, we got some. That's clear?
Yep, you're good. Sorry about that.
Okay, all right, no problem, thanks. The second step in the design process, schematic design. This is a schematic design level illustrative plan. Here, the plan starts to take on a more defined form. The plan starts to illustrate all the buildings, the outdoor spaces, the land entrances from each direction, paving patterns and colors, tree locations along Main Street, sidewalks, and prop locations. Here's where we first start thinking about the use of different materials such as brick, paving, concrete, or asphalt. And so the plan starts to show hints of that different material. We also look at how the trees should be spaced, what type they should be in order to not block the views of building facades. And we show that we've aligned the street to terminate at a view of a key scene. So again, this is a schematic design level drawing. Let me focus on this area here to explain the difference between schematic design and the next step in the process. Here you see the design team's original intent was to go with brick fields defined by concrete bands for this outdoor dining patio. But here's what we eventually ended up going with. This is a design development plan for the same patio. This is the third step in the design process. During this phase, due to cost and maintenance issues, we decided to reverse the pattern and go with concrete fields and brick bands. Everything about the design is evaluated and developed in greater detail during this phase. The plan, which was previously drawn by hand, now using roughly correct proportions and dimensions, is now drafted out with more precision. Everything gets refined and worked out to exact dimensions. For example, we end up with exact dimensions for standard green screen panels that will work between the architectural columns. We work out the detail for how the bricks are to be cut where the bands intersect. We take into account the exact slope of the street when dimensioning the concrete base to ensure that the bricks could be installed level. And we specify how to construct the tire marks in the street so that they're permanent and able to withstand all the foot traffic and nightly pressure washing, which occurs in theme parks. Also, a major part of the design development phase is working out the fine details of all the elements included in the schematic design phase. For example, the schematic plan may have identified something as a hub feature or shrub planting on a metal trellis. Well, it's in design development that we want to identify what that hub feature is and specify what that shrub should be. We use CAD, SketchUp, and hand-drawn studies to explore what the exact size, detail, and materials will be for each of the elements. For example, image 3 was used to work out the exact dimensions of the green screen panels between the columns. Image 1 is a hand-drawn sketch of a decorative column, which was then modeled in SketchUp, and our image 2. And then we added a little more of the site context to the model to better understand the columns' proportions. And we use these hand sketches and models for many of these elements. And in the final design development package, these are all then converted to CAD plans, elevations, and sections. Step 4 in the design process, the construction document stage. By the time we get to this stage, the design should be fixed, all or most of the material selected, and everything should be drawn to scale. During this stage, we are focused on coordinating between all the involved disciplines, detailing how things are to be connected and attached, and verifying our details with manufacturers. This drawing calls out all of our design features and elements, as well as those designed by other disciplines. Everything should be coordinated and illustrated on these plans. Here you see some construction document level details. You might recall the upper green screen elevation, which was carried over from the design development phase. Below that are a few more details providing more info on the green screen as well as the planter it's attached to. At this point, the details are completed. Specific products have been specified, such as green screen, and everything has been coordinated with the product manufacturers and other design disciplines on the team. And also by this point, we've requested product samples so that the creative team and the owner's maintenance team could see and hold the product before they give us their approval. Here are a few more enlarged details so you can see the amount of specificity that goes into each one. A big part of the work is coordinating with the other disciplines. For example, The structural engineer will verify the size of the footing shown in our detail and will design the structural steel in the footing. For the planter wall detail on the right, we needed to be sure that the structural engineer did not fill in the gap between the two sections supporting the wall with concrete. This would have been the easiest and least expensive way to construct, but as a planter, we needed to drain. So leaving this area free to drain was ultimately less expensive than filling that gap in with concrete, and then having to add special drains, and then having to have the civil engineer connect them to the storm sewer. In the section on the left, we needed to be sure that the structural engineer understood that the footing had to extend below the adjacent street paving and that the concrete base actually got taller as the street sloped. We developed the base so that the brick on the top of the base would be level and full size. These are small but important details which were worked out during the design development phase, and we needed to make sure this detail not only gets into our final package, but that it gets coordinated with all the other disciplines. Again, coordination is key, especially if we want the next step in the process, which is construction observation, to go smoothly. An important element of construction documentation is the schedule. Schedule shows this particular schedule shows the typical amount of detail we specify for every paving type used on the project. For example, under comments, we will include references to any samples or special notes. Under mock-ups, mock-ups generally refer to the owner's mock-up yard with identification numbers for the contractor to locate. For this project, at the time these drawings were completed, it had not been decided yet if the owner was going to mock up the paving, so that info was not provided here. Paving finishes, specific vendors and level of treatments are noted. Color, again, we specify a specific vendor, supplier, such as Schofield, and then the specific color. And in this case, we were calling for multicolored tile pieces to be embedded in the concrete with about a 20% coverage rate. And pattern, so sometimes patterns are easily laid out in the plan, and so we'll note that, we'll state per plan. But in theme parks, we sometimes use a phrase known as per art direction. This is used when it is not possible to show something accurately in the drawing. For example, an old cracked street. So what we do is include a photograph of the old street for reference, and then the art director or someone from our office would be on site when the concrete is being finished and direct the contractor to the location and the amount of cracks to be placed in the new concrete.
We spend a lot of time in the field observing the construction. The expected level of quality on a theme park is much higher than a public works project or a developer project. It requires a lot of attention to every detail. For example, are all the curves of the curbs and walls smooth? Are all the curbs exactly 6 inches wide? Does the decorative paving match the samples? In this example, the amount of glass placed on the surface had to be both meet the sample that was approved and be consistent over every pour. This finishing took 3 days to complete, and we were there all 3 days to make sure that it was done the same way every time. As we said earlier, one of the differences in the theme park world is we get to install very large plant material. Well, that's not without its own challenges. First, it usually needs to be installed before the paving. That's not typical for most contractors. So we require them to locate the trees by survey in exactly the right location and exactly the right elevation.
The image at the lower right shows a mock-up of the assembly used for the trees planted along the street. Now, due to a high volume of foot traffic in the park, it was very important to maximize the amount of paving under that tree. You can see the metal grate covers the entire tree pit. The pavers sit on top of it, and the metal guard finishes and hides the edges of the pavers. The metal grate also provides a way for the maintenance crew to have access to and make sure that the drip irrigation is working. And just in case the tree ever needs to be replaced, the entire assembly, both grate and pavers, is designed to be removed to allow for the installation of its replacement.
I might mention that after we did this install, we learned that the volume of pressure washing and the way the maintenance crews did that, they were putting too much water into the tree. And so that grate on the top was changed to eliminate the spaces that you see and then add a collar along the top to prevent water from running into the tree root ball.
So an important part of this phase of work is visiting various nurseries to find and select trees. For those of you who love the outdoors and love spending someone else's money, this is probably one of your favorite parts of the process. As mentioned earlier, one of the differences between theme park work and a standard project is that you're looking for plant material which will look fully grown when installed. This plant material is often more expensive and sometimes very difficult to track down. But it's important because selecting the proper material has a major impact on the visual story one is hoping to tell. For this particular project, we went out in search of 8 trees that all had to match in form and height and trunk diameter. And all 8 had to have branching that started high enough for park guests to walk under. This picture shows on the left, shows a very good selection of trees, but nonetheless, it took quite a bit of time and walking to find those chosen 8.
Now, the picture on the right was not part of the project that we're sharing with you today, but I included it especially for Walter because he likes to tell this story. It's from a project that we actually completed in the year 2000. This particular IP, which you may recognize, did not use any straight lines, and the team wanted to use palm trees in the design. Fortunately, we were able to find these 2 trees which had been damaged in a hurricane, and they fit our needs exactly.
When working in an existing theme park, tree installation is most likely going to occur at night after the park is closed. And since one of our roles during the process is to observe the layout and installation of trees and shrubs, that means that there will be moments when you'll find yourself in a dark, almost empty theme park at 2 o'clock in the morning, which if you have the opportunity to do so, I'd recommend because it's a very unique experience. So with the park empty of all guests, the trucks and cranes and plant material are brought in through the park and installed with easy access. But as you can see in the pictures, due to the size of these trees, it's quite an operation. The picture on the top left is of an 80-inch box sycamore tree that was over 40 feet tall. The pictures on the right are shrubs waiting to be planted, and the other picture shows them planted. The landscape architect gets to arrange the shrub planting, but fortunately, someone else has to do all the hard work.
So we've just shown you some drawings that represent the process and the documentation as to how a project gets built. We'd now like to share just a few images with you to show what a finished land looks like after construction was completed. This new land had to be true to life to the animated television program, recreating one section of Main Street from Springfield, USA. In this image, you can see how the architecture, landscape, paving, lighting, and signage all work together to create the desired character of Springfield.
And in these images, you can see many of the constructed elements that we had to first envision and then design with enough detail to allow each item to be constructed as envisioned.
So as we conclude the presentation, we'd like to just share our view of two major opportunities now occurring in the theme park industry for those people that are thinking of becoming landscape architects. First, many of the most experienced landscape architects working in the theme park industry are retiring. Jeff Morosky, who was the head of landscape architecture at Disney, just retired several months ago. Barry McKinley, with the same role at Universal, retired about 2 years ago. This creates tremendous opportunities for young landscape architects.
Second opportunity is the required use of Revit by owners and developers of the theme parks. Here's the description of Revit by Autodesk, the author of the software program. Quote, Revit is BIM software widely used by architects, engineers, and contractors to create a unified model with all disciplines and trades can use and complete their work. Now, notice there was no mention of landscape architects there, which is unfortunate because the program right now isn't really geared towards a landscape architect. Myself, I was trained in AutoCAD and I used it daily, so one becomes proficient in it. And I was able to become proficient in SketchUp on my own because it was fun and I had a low learning curve. These two programs, I'd estimate I use about 75% of the time, and Photoshop and Illustrator filling in the remainder. To learn Revit, I took a 20-hour class sponsored by the office. We then had a Revit expert come to the office weekly to teach us additional tools and methods to model, specifically for a particular project. After that, I was very interested in learning more, so I took another 10-week class that met every Saturday. Then after that training, I felt like I could successfully complete modeling typical components, maybe preparing a landscape plan, drawing as long as it contains straight walls and flat surfaces, nothing too complicated. And I also think I could model some complex object. But Revit is not something that I use on a daily or even weekly basis yet. So I need more training and practice and a lot more time to become proficient in it. So I'll close by saying Dan is right. There's a great opportunity for upcoming landscape architects, and those that are able to master Revit will be extremely valuable to owners developing theme parks and landscape architecture firms planning and designing theme parks.
Very good. Good job, Dan. Good job, Maro. Thank you very much. So as you guys have been talking, we've gotten a bunch of questions in the chat window. And so I'm going to go ahead and read some of these, and then between the two of you decide which one wants to respond to it.
Okay.
One of the first comments that came through was they were impressed with how far in advance the tree yards, or the what's the term you guys use? The
Nursery.
the nurseries. Thank you. How far in advance those are, and I've heard stories that that's probably the first thing that happens as they plan a theme park is to get the nursery together. Can you talk more about how long it takes some of these trees and plants to mature?
Well, it's quite a long time. Usually a nursery cannot be started early enough. And so an owner will usually buy plant material that might come in a 24 or 36 inch box. And if given 4 or 5 years, that plant material will get up to a 48 inch box size. But what a lot of owners will also do will include all of the shrub planting in their nursery. And that will grow much quicker and provide a big help in terms of meeting the requirements of a theme park.
Very cool. Here's a fun question. Someone asked, in your years of doing landscape architecture for theme parks, have you ever incorporated any of that stuff into either your own backyards or some family and friends' backyards?
Well, yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I was going to say our office doesn't do many residential projects, but I can tell you the design of theme parks has clearly permeated our other projects. For example, we recently did a streetscape project for the city of Buena Park in California. And the street that we worked on was Beach Boulevard. And for some strange reason, a section of it just happened to run between Knott's Berry Farm and Soak City. And it's a 6-lane arterial with a very high volume of traffic. And what was happening during the Halloween Horror Night period is parents, rather than waiting in the car to drop their car off at the drop off of Knott's Berry Farm, dropped them off on the other side of the street. And so a dark 6-lane street, kids were running across the street, jaywalking. It was a really dangerous situation. So as part of the streetscape, the city asked us to design a fence and showed us examples that other cities have done with a 6-foot metal typical fence. And we said, well, wait, what if we designed a fence that meandered both in plan and elevation and looked like a roller coaster? It would announce the parks and clearly make your city different than all the other cities along this arterial. And this arterial, if you can imagine, starts in the mountains of Los Angeles and goes all the way to the ocean. Well, they loved the idea. They actually doubled the budget for the projects and did that. And it's clearly something we wouldn't have even thought about doing if we hadn't come from that theme park world where we're telling a story and thinking about how to make landscape really different, immersive, and unique.
Cool. Maro, did you have any stories for your backyard?
Maro did have a big statue of Mickey Mouse in his backyard, but someone made him take it down. So.
I'm sorry, I muted because ambulance passed right now, so but it's gone now. So yeah, I just wanted to share that sometimes we do have a nursery rep that comes to our office, and they come over with a lot of goodies, a lot of plant samples of new material, and we have a raffle. So when that occurs, we do get to take some of these new shrubs home to install in our backyard, and I have several of them there.
A little perk. I like
That's
it.
right.
Thank you. One of the other questions one of our students asked, they observed in your master plans, you use a lot of colors, and if the colors, if there's a standard for what the colors mean, is there some sort of industry standard related to that?
Well, there are other exhibits that I didn't share that do use some standards that actually come out of urban planning. So we, in a master plan, will prepare a different exhibit that identifies building by function. And so there's some standard colors of reds and blues and purples and greens that define those. But in the other graphics, what we're trying to do both in the colors, the font, and the drawing style is capture what this park is about. And so if you were to look through a history of all of our work, hopefully you'll see those differences, and hopefully they begin to tell you, enrich the story differently in a very subtle way.
Cool. Another question, is there a specific tree that you tend to avoid because it doesn't survive well in a theme park environment?
Maro, you want me to do this one?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Well, I think of one.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's a specific tree, but there are some issues that we have to deal with. So there's a whole list of toxic or poisonous plant material. And so the first thing you need to do is make sure that your plan doesn't contain any of those. You also have to look really closely about the leaf drop or fruit drop of a tree. Now, theme parks are different than most environments because they receive a really high degree of maintenance and they're pressure washed every evening. But what you don't want to do is have a tree that has a lot of fruit in a dining area that's going to attract birds. And all of a sudden, you're not only worried about fruit drop, but bird drop.
Oh,
Yeah, you also have to be worried about plants that are prolific at flowering and attracting bees near food areas. So there are things that you do or don't do that are specific to the location of the tree. We used a tree in Shrek that actually had a green bark, which matched the color of Shrek, but it also had thorns on the trunk. And after it was installed, the owner's team realized that that could be a potential problem. So we were out there with a hammer knocking all those thorns off, which is
too bad because it went well with the theme of Shrek, I thought.
Yeah. So I won't be using that tree again.
Live and learn, right? Live and learn.
Yes.
So one of the other questions that we have is how are landscape architects involved in designing cues, and how do the theoretical through counts affect the cue design?
Maro, you want me to do this one?
Yeah, go. Yeah.
Okay.
If it involves numbers, Dan can.
I'm picking all the questions for Dan.
All right. So first of all, in the program, as we mentioned, the rides have different, or attractions have different ratings, and with those ratings, it is in addition to the ratings is the capacity of the ride, and the owner and the design team will look at how much wait time they want in a ride. So if you have a simple round ride, you might say, well, it's not going to be really popular, so we'll have 15 minutes of capacity in that queue. Whereas as opposed to if you had a dark ride around a Harry Potter theme, you might have an hour of capacity in the queue and then know that that's going to be exceeded and have another half hour of overflow capacity. So that's the first step is determining that capacity of the queue. And from that, you can turn it to a length of queue. And then you get into the actual design. Some of the rules we were taught early on by people that had far more experience than us is that you never want to surprise people if at all possible. So don't hide the queue. Let them see as much of it as possible when they get in, so they know what they're in for. Now, most parks now have signs that tell you that you have a 20-minute wait or a 45-minute wait. So that alleviates some of that. Another rule, though, is always have people moving towards the front of the queue. Don't design a queue so that there's a long run that looks like you're almost at the front and then bring people to the back. So usually that means that the queue is going to be perpendicular to from the beginning of the queue to its ultimate destination, to the entrance.
Got it.
And I'll just add that a lot of times we're given a number, like a linear footage number, that this queue needs to be based on the analysis that was made for that ride. And then it'll be our job to kind of find the routing, where the switchbacks are, like Dan mentioned, design it in a way to not piss off the guy who's waiting. You know, what he mentioned about it looks like you're almost there and then it throws you back. Not a very good experience. So we want to make sure we design something that's not gonna do that.
Good point.
Walter also mentioned, that a lot of attention had been paid by the major companies to try to bring interest to the queue. So you might see animated graphics. There'll be spaces to put props and other information. We put in aisles so that drinks or other things can be sold in the queue. Monitors to tell stories almost as a pre-show. So that has changed a lot because it's probably the number one complaint waiting in that queue that people have for going to theme parks.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. This is an interesting question. What are some specific design features that have impacted the guest immersion into the big idea more than you expected it to?
Uh,
That's a tricky one.
You know, I'm not sure this answers the question directly, I think in Universal Islands of Adventure, and neither one of these were our ideas. They were actually developed by the Universal design team. Is the bridge that goes from the port of entry to Superheroes, which includes the coaster that goes both above and below that bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can imagine this, you know, as you come into the park, you walk down to the port of entry, you're deciding if you go right to Seuss Landing or left to Superheroes, and you cross that bridge, and just at the minute you're crossing, that coaster goes by you. It's really quite an amazing experience. And so I think you could anticipate that it would be really cool, but anticipating it and experiencing it, it really, you know, got your heart racing, and I think made for a really fantastic entry to the first land.
Cool. Yeah. For that specific example, I think you can really feel the anger of the coaster for the character that the coaster is based on. So it's pretty impactful.
Yes.
Okay, we're coming up on the end of our time here. I have one more question for you, and then we'll wrap it up. The last question is: growing trees that big in boxes have significant root balls. Does that make it harder to grow those trees? And is that a consideration when selecting the trees?
Well, I'm not sure I would say it's harder. It just takes time. So, you know, trees are oftentimes grown in containers. And then as they reach a certain size, they're put into larger containers. When they get really big, like 72 or 80 inch, they're actually grown in the ground and then dug out. So that requires some specific planning, because you want to, before you dig that tree out, a year or so before, want to root prune or trim back the roots so that they, behind the trimming, they grow more roots and have a better system. But and then, as we talked about, there are some real issues in terms of planting, because typically you shouldn't pave underneath the canopy of a tree.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes in a theme park, we need that area for pedestrian movement. So we've come up with many unique details to handle that.
And I'll just add, Dan, that maybe it's not harder to grow, but it's going to be a lot harder to move, to transport from the nursery to
That's right.
the theme park and then install.
Good point. Actually, I was going to end on that one, but there's one more in here that I found very interesting. I'd love to get your take on it. So let me just read it to you. In many of the areas that our industry designs for theme parks, they use arbor, horticulture, and various kinds of plant life that are not native to where the construction occurs or where the theme park is located. What is done to minimize the amount of invasive species, yet continue to stay with the theming, style guide, and art direction without doing damage to the surrounding environment?
Well, fortunately for us, every state also publishes an invasive species list. And so just like that list of poisonous and toxic plants, the one thing we do on every project is pull up that list for wherever we're working and make sure that we're not using any plants on it. Now, if we're working in a foreign country, sometimes they're not as sophisticated as the government is in terms of producing that kind of information in the US. And so we will try to research through local universities or other institutions information about toxic plants. And as a last resort, we'll look at a location that's in a similar area that'll have similar plant material and make sure we're not using any invasive plant material. So invasive plant material is pretty much a no-no in theme park work and non-theme park work.
Okay, got it. Okay, I think that's probably enough for this session. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Maro, so much for your time and preparing and presenting this topic. I did want to remind everybody that if for whatever reason you missed a portion of the presentation, we did record the entire thing. So we are going to be posting this to the TEA's YouTube channel as part of this series. And I do just want to point out that this will be a recurring series, so we should have our next one here on architecture here soon. Our next TEA education event will be April 28th. It'll be a behind the scenes experience for the Hunger Games exhibit in Las Vegas. We are always having TEA events, so keep an eye out for other types of events as well. And with that, I'd like to say thank you all so much for joining us. And we hope to see you in our next session. So take care and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Walter.
Take care.